It's taken a second. Here we go.
Hey, LA Progressive friends and family. This is Sharon Kyle here with you, and along with my husband and partner, Dick Price. And we are going to be having a nice conversation again with Henry Giroux. He currently holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the English and Cultural Studies Department, and is the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. His latest book is The Burden of Conscience, Educating Beyond the Veil of Silence. And he is LA Progressive's associate editor. Hi, Henry.
Hi, Sharon. Hi, Dick. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here for us. We started a conversation with you actually before we began to press the button, as we often do. And you used the term that we have a cultural apparatus that supports Trump's all of his plans. And the topic of this conversation is the war on memory, how Trump's cultural erasure threatens democracy in the United States and Canada. And let's talk about this cultural apparatus that supports this.
I think that one of the things that people fail to realize, just to sort of preface that with another commentary, and that is that controlling public culture is really central to the consolidation of fascist power. So we don't begin by talking about the apparatuses, we begin by talking about the relevance of culture when it's controlled by basically thugs, billionaires, the most powerful elements of gangster capitalism, who basically understand something about culture. They understand that they have to erase memory, they have to normalize cruelty, they have to forge loyal subjects, and in doing so, they basically turn politics into a pathology. And I think the cultural apparatuses, whether we're talking about the far right cultural apparatus, which is really one of the most dominant cultural apparatuses in the United States, or we're talking about mainstream media, whether we're talking about digital platforms or we're just talking about television or radio. 90% of the media in the United States is controlled by 5 corporations, from Comcast to Disney. What that means is that not only is knowledge now used in the service of basically power that subverts the truth, if not destroys it, but it basically creates forms of agency and consciousness that succumb to basically forms of erasure, forms of knowledge that basically is rooted in ignorance, forms of consciousness that in some fundamental way embody what my friend Chauncey DeVaga calls white racial erasure, forms of legislation and policies that are legitimated by this cultural apparatus, in which the Smithsonian now becomes an agency of white supremacy, an agency of lies, an agency of erasure, or an agency in which memory operates not in the service of truth or of history or of possibility, but in the service of domination. And I think that the element of culture at work here has never been, it seems to me, more obvious than it is today. Culture is the terrain on which the fight for democracy is going to be won, because that's the terrain in which understanding becomes the predicate for collective action.
So it's hard to know how much credit to give Trump. He seems to operate on impulse and resentment, but the people around him do know what they're doing, and you could see there is a method to this madness of blackmailing elite universities into dropping courses on racial justice or ethnic studies, and making corporations drop DEI programs, and changing what, and as you mentioned, changing what is shown in public museums. You can see if that lasted over some time, you could raise a whole new generation that saw the world very differently than the three of us do, or than most Americans do. And how likely do you think that will succeed?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's not covered in the mainstream media, but it is being covered in some ways by brave people like Rachel Maddow and others and yourselves and Counterpunch and Truth Out and a host of other, The Intercept, who are making clear that there really are forms of resistance all over the country on a local level that are demonstrating against this kind of fascism. I mean, Trump goes to the Open there, and he's booed,
Right.
right? He goes to a restaurant last night, and
Yeah.
they're calling him Hitler, right? He can't go out because people are well aware that this attack is so fundamentally, in some way, connected to the institutions that they inhabit by which they run their lives, whether it be schools for their kids, whether it be museums, whether it be the elimination of ideas from the press, or whether it be in the form of, for instance, this recent meme he creates, right? Which is really unbelievable. I mean, because it's so off the charts in terms of its cruelty, its crudity, its celebration of what I would call the fetishization of cruelty and the performance of violence as a ritual, that it just seems to forecast a regime, not just Trump, but a regime for which the spectacle of militarization and racism and censorship and erasure is unchanged, unabashed, no apologies. I mean, I don't want to talk about Epstein stuff because it's a kind of a diversion, right? But the fact of the matter is now you have signatures that are obvious that he's done, and you get his press secretary standing up there lying like a parrot on some kind of steroid. Oh, that's not Trump's that's not Trump's signature. And I say that because it's part of a whole range of other forms of cultural politics in which the spectacle of education begins to normalize war, glorify white Christian nationalism, and manipulates memory. Well, when you ask me about resistance, you can only manipulate memory so far, right? You can only lie so far. I mean, in the face of an authoritarianism that the mainstream press refuses to name, right? Only now are some outlets saying, whoa, this sounds like fascism. Of course, it sounds like fascism. But what they refuse to acknowledge is that there are parallels with history that they could use to make this more obvious. I mean, when Trump says he wants to change the Department of Defense to the Department of War, when he says he loves the smell of deportation in the morning, when he patterns his own image after a kind of psychotic general soldier in a film who claims he loves the smell of napalm, which is really about the smell of genocide. It's about the smell of death, right? The reaction should be so overwhelming that we don't treat it as comical. We don't treat it as something that's on the fringe of somebody's sanity. We should treat it as a form of militarized madness that has taken over the culture, that has taken over the government. I mean, and it seems to me we need to rethink memory not as some form of nostalgia that's simply being erased, but as the grounds for justice, as the grounds for knowledge, as the grounds for critique, as the grounds for mobilizing people, as the grounds for saying, hey, look, there's something in the past you need to be aware of because the ghost of the past is haunting us and is reproducing itself in ways that speak to a future that's unimaginable. Unimaginable. People in mass abducting people off the streets, sending people to prisons that basically without due process. I mean, all of this goes somewhere. There are two things here. One, memory tells us that it's not only dangerous, but in the past it led to the extermination of multiple forms of people, from Jews, the communists, the Marxists, the critics, who basically tried to hold power accountable. Secondly, you can't treat this as a joke. You have to understand that this is a form of pedagogical terrorism that produces a politics of pathology. That has to be understood. And we have to begin to understand how the forms of manipulation work in the culture here to basically legitimate and normalize this stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Henry. I've been really down lately, and generally we don't really talk about my feelings when we do these episodes or these conversations. But clearly, I am within a group of people that has generally been targeted. And as I'm watching what's happening, one of the things that I focused on is when you talked about a cultural apparatus that supports Trump, what I continue to see is that we really do have an appetite for what Trump is doing. We already have that as a nation. I mean, he couldn't have this alligator Alcatraz, and they've got all these other names. I have them up here on the screen: alligator Alcatraz, Speedway Slammer, Cornhusker Clink, Louisiana Lockup. These are 4 different
Concentration camps.
Yeah, concentration camps. They make no bones about it. They treat this as if it's comical, and the United States of America, for the most part, does nothing. And so I want to again talk about, well, how do we shape culture? So I'm sure you've heard of this term, the Overton window. And the Overton window is, according to the dictionary, the spectrum of ideas on public policy and social issues considered acceptable by the general public, but that can be shaped by the media.
I mean, look, we need a new language here, right? I mean, what are we talking about? We're basically talking about education as a form of depoliticization. That's what we're really talking about. And we're asking ourselves, what is it about that form of depoliticization that points to a vision that basically is a form of necropolitics, a form of death, a form of suffering, a form of misery, a form of militarized madness, a kind of, it seems to me, and this is what becomes interesting for me, the glorification of cruelty is a form of pleasure. And I think that what is increasingly normalized in this culture is a notion of violence as not just something that should educate us about what shouldn't take place and what are the forces that produce it, but as a form, one of the few places left where there's an emotional quotient.
Erasure that threatens democracy. In
the Hold US on just a moment. Published. Just a moment. Okay, go ahead.
It offers an emotional quotient in which it's one of the few places where people can feel anything. And I think that's where fascism reveals itself as something so horrible, so terrible, that we need to understand really immediately, in some ways, what is it about that kind of fetishization of cruelty and pleasure and emotion and feelings and desires suggests that in the United States today, a new kind of subject is being created. And what is the basis for that construction? Civic illiteracy, militarized ignorance, a kind of extreme individualism, the attacks on solidarity, the collapse of the social state, the rise of the punishing state. When you talk about prisons or you talk about cruelty, you have to talk about apparatuses that are both displaced, that challenge them, and the apparatuses that basically take their place, right? And what we see now that I feel in some ways kind of energized about, and what we see now is that the forms of legitimation that have been used in the past to justify the worst forms of gangster capitalism and white supremacy, terms like, well, we don't need equal opportunity in schools. Yeah, right. I mean, that's the language of deception. That's liberals parading as being insightful, but actually support a form of gangster capitalism, at the endpoint of which we are now in. And the endpoint is fascism. I mean, Brecht was right. Adorno was right. Horkheimer was right. So it seems to me that what we are now seeing is there are choices that have become obvious in which one lives or dies, in which one fights for the future or one succumbs to the lack of a future. And I think too many young people are being written out of the future. Too many people are not going to be able to afford their food. Too many people won't have health care. 11 million is going to knock off in a year. How much longer can this go on without not just local resistance, but the kind of mass resistance that results in direct action? Look, I don't believe in violence, but I do believe that if we have mass action in the streets in DC, in Chicago, this mayor of Chicago, he's a brave guy, I mean, he's a brave guy. You know, he knows how to talk. He's articulate. He's telling people, and here's the word, resist. Don't just get angry, resist. Find ways to do it. You have to shut down institutions to do that. You have to confront force in ways that educate people to see its most extreme manifestations. And people will get hurt. There's no question. But I want to hope, like in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, when those young people went to counters, those young black students who got tossed around, or the dogs were set loose on people, that it'll be a breaking point. And I really believe it's coming. And I think that our job as people who are public intellectuals is to make this as visible as possible, this grotesque, militarized madness, this kind of fetishization of cruelty, so that people can see it and be able to understand how it links to their lives and what needs to be done. I'm not pessimistic. I'm sad about the state of politics, but I am not pessimistic about the possibility of resistance. That's the difference.
Yeah, you know, in some ways, we on the liberal side bear a fair amount of responsibility for this. I mean, 10 years ago, when Trump came down the escalator and was talking about the Mexicans coming across the border and their rapists and their murders, we got upset. We wrote editorials about it, but then we went on to the next thing. And Trump ultimately got away when he talked about grabbing women by the genitals. I mean, people mocked it and made fun of it and made videos about it and were upset, and yet he got away with it, and he actually generated support by it. And that's what happens here. If he gets away with something, he does more of it. And I don't know. It seems like now we're at a point where, as you say, now we have to be out in the street. Now we have to get beaten in the head by these thugs that are roaming around our neighborhoods. And I think that's what we do have to do. We will see if we have the will to do it or if we'll move on to the next thing.
I really believe in civic courage. I think that civic courage is kind of endemic to the very language of democracy, however timid it can be sometimes. But I think that what we have to get away from is the individualization of politics. We have to get away from collapsing the political into the personal. And it's not just about this crazy guy coming down an elevator who's spouting racist nonsense, or, you know, who wants to grab women by the genitals because he believes they all love him for some reason with his little, you know, with his lips that look like the anus of a small dog. I mean, I think that, or a mind unburdened by a complicated immoral thought. I think that what we really have to ask ourselves are, what are the institutions that failed, that allow this logic of liberalism to basically support a form of capitalism that basically is not too far away from forms of fascism? You know, what cultural politics what are the institutions and what are the cultural that we've ignored? When he came down that elevator, the first thing we should have asked ourselves is, hey, look, wait a minute, this is fascism. This has a long legacy in slavery. This is a long legacy in the wiping out of indigenous populations when this country was founded. It has a long legacy in what it did with Japanese internment during the Second World War. It has a long legacy of a culture of fear, all of which have closed what I call the horizons of democracy. Each decade, we get closer to closing the horizons of democracy. That's a crisis, but that crisis is not matched by a crisis of ideas. It's not matched by a comprehensive historical understanding of where we've come from, what institutions have allowed it to happen, and how we have lost any sense of collective social responsibility. What has been destroyed in the last 30 years is basically a notion of the social, the notion of solidarity, the notion of social institutions, the notion of the welfare state, the notion of the common good, the notion of the public good. All of this, he is basically the endpoint in now eradicating all of these institutions because we haven't challenged that legacy. We haven't challenged that slow kind of evisceration of the institutions, the mindset, the modes of education and culture that make, it seems to me, democracy, certainly a socialist democracy, possible. We cannot have a democracy when 5 families control more than 70% of all the wealth in the country. How do you talk about democracy when money drives politics? Why don't people know this?
Yes.
Why is this on the front page of every newspaper every day? Why aren't people looking at these deportations and saying, you're next?
Yes, right.
But
So,
next,
so I want to talk about why don't people know this? And I'd like to say that if we look at the birth of neoliberalism, and oftentimes people talk about the Powell memo that was written in
yeah,
1971, sort of being the
Mhm.
start of the neoliberal movement. I like to talk about how that memo landed in 1971 in in an environment that was ready to receive that message. So,
look, yeah,
right.
so,
So when we look back and we say, oh, things just went downhill from there on, I like to believe that no, actually, we had the seeds of cancer; they were already there. Now we're in we're seeing the metastasis, if that's the correct word, of this dropping of the whole neoliberal philosophy. We're seeing it full blown, but the seeds for it were there and the land was prepared for it in
look,
1971.
I think that's a very provocative and very insightful intervention. And I'll tell you why. That intervention, people like Christopher Newfield, Chris Hedges, and a whole range, Angela Davis, a whole range of people have talked about this. What we saw in 1970 was a counter-revolution. It was the beginning of a counter-revolution. That revolution was against the 60s.
Mhm.
That revolution was against the fact that institutions like education were all of a sudden opening up to multiple groups that could potentially change the political climate of the country. That counter-revolution was overwhelming. And what was overwhelming about it was that the right figured out, as the Powell memo, which I have written about, has made very clear that this war against the left, against progressives, against well-meaning liberals, if I may, had to be fought on the level of ideas. It had to be fought on the level of culture. What did the Powell memo say? It said, hey, look, we need alternative modes of education. We need to take over the media. We need to put institutions in academia that represent our point of view. All of a sudden, what do you have? You have all these foundations now being financed. All of a sudden, you have a left that is so overwhelmingly concerned with the question of winning the cultural war because they understood that education was central to politics, that neoliberal ideology. And what is it? What is it? I mean, how do you explain it? Look, the market is the template of all social relationships, right? Individualism is the only unit that matters. People are not socially responsible for what they do. I'm sorry, individuals are responsible for what they do. The market, the only relations that matter are commercial relations. And it goes on and on. Self-interest is the essence of what living is about. Human needs have to be subordinated to the accumulation of capital. This is the most dangerous ideology since the divine right of kings. But at the same time, the divine right of kings ended. Don't forget, right? And that ideology has lost its legitimacy. Do you really believe that they can say any longer, we are really here for social and economic mobility? No, now that ideology is a fascist ideology. And that's where the left and progressives and liberals and people who care about democracy have to fight this battle. You don't fight a battle unless you know the enemy. You don't fight a battle unless you understand the basic evolution of an ideology that ends up in fascism. You don't fight a battle until you understand why all these billionaires, for instance, now are on the side of Trump. I mean, all these techies who go to a dinner party with Trump and are saying things like, you're so wonderful, or you're such a... I mean, these are acolytes. We saw this in Nazi Germany. We saw it in Italy under Mussolini. These are nothing more than Vichy traitors. It has to be named for that. When somebody sits next to a fascist, I mean, can you imagine if they were sitting next to Adolf Hitler in the 30s? I mean, the press then would have said, whoa, what's this? Not a peep. Hardly, oh, isn't this terrible? Oh, look at these toadies. Well, wait a minute. These are people supporting fascism.
Right.
Let's name it, right? How do we begin to fight this? So it seems to me that this cultural tsunami, if I can call it, is so overwhelming that it's becoming increasingly difficult, even for right-wing Republicans, to be able to say this is normal. Why do you think they're arguing for gerrymandering? Why do you think they're totally for voter suppression? Why do you think you have a police state emerging in which the National Guard now in 26 will probably be in every major city in the country intimidating people because he wants a dictatorship. They want a dictatorship. And I think we have to start talking about what the stakes are, and we have to do it as much as we can. We have to repeat ourselves as much as we can, and we have to talk about who's going to lose the most. And the people going to lose the most are poor people, are workers, are blacks, are people of color, are immigrants. This is a national emergency. This is a firewall. This is a 5-alarm fire. And we need a language basically that correlates with making that visible.
Right, Henry. And I want to emphasize that there are people who are going to lose the most, but ultimately everybody's going to lose because solidarity is so important. And part of the problem with solidarity is there are people who think that, oh, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with me. So
Right.
I don't have to get involved. We need to make it clear that this is going to impact all of us, except
Right.
for the handful of people, and even them ultimately, the ones that were kissing his ring, the
toadies.
tech bros, yeah.
So a part of what's going on, it seems to me what we have now is the full flowering of that ideology that came out of the Powell memo. Maybe it was always under the covers or back in the boardrooms where it was said that ultimately we want to do away with the social contract. We really don't want to support the poor. But now we're actually taking away Medicaid. Now we're disemboweling education. Now we're just letting the poor hoist by their own petard and focus on the elites and the wealthy. And I think that's was always a part of the ideology, but now it's coming into realization.
But there's something missing here, and if I may, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that ideology now has no clothes, right? It's barefaced, but it has so lost its legitimacy as a viable political intervention and ideology that it now needs to create force to implement what it believes.
Right.
And I think this is what we often miss.
That's right.
The age of simply fighting that battle on the culture front is over. You know, but they're not fighting it. They're censoring books. They're destroying universities.
Mhm.
They're trying to eliminate anybody who holds power accountable.
Mhm.
That's not just censorship. That's a form of militarized violence.
Mhm.
That militarized violence is now being expanded through the use of actually putting American forces in the United States on domestic grounds against the American people. This is an entirely new register of oppression. And so I think what we need to do is we need to make that connection clear. And the connection is that ideology has never been about justice. It has never been about racial equality. It has never been about, it seems to me, expanding the common good. It's really about fascism. It's really about dictatorships. It's really about enriching the leaders of the financial elite. Why did the billionaires in this country support this stuff? They support it because they love capitalism, because gangster capitalism, they feel, doesn't have to justify itself anymore. All they have to do is say, hey, that's anti-Semitic. Hey, you're an American. Hey, you don't believe in democracy. They throw out this nonsense, and they just keep repeating it, like Goebbels said, repeat it enough and people believe it. But at the same time, when it starts to bear down on people's lives and they don't have health care, they don't have Social Security, they're being wiped off Medicaid, poverty is increasing, inequality is off the books. The United States has become a joke internationally. All of a sudden, it seems to me the crisis that we face politically and economically, that the crisis of ideas is unraveling. It's becoming less a crisis and more an opportunity. And that's where I'm optimistic. Fascist regimes never last that long. They never last that long. I mean, and this is not to say that this could be the end of the planet, because they could destroy the planet. We could have a nuclear war, or the ecological damage could be irreversible at some point. But the fact of the matter is, I see more resistance now, though I don't see it united, than actually I think I saw in the 60s. I mean, if you look at the channels of resistance that are emerging all over the country, huge demonstrations. I mean, people are coming out at a local level. This is not one segment. It's not just young people, right? It's not just basically a portion of, let's say, the black elite, the liberals. It's not just brown people who are fighting for immigration rights. I mean, this is really something that is so overwhelmingly dictatorial and authoritarian that it seems to point to a crisis that is hard to miss. And I don't think they can control this anymore. And I'll tell you why. They wouldn't be putting soldiers on the streets if they could control it. You understand? The educational nonsense has turned into caricature. It's now caricature. You know, I mean, Trump with his little apocalypse now hat on, you know, these videos of him in Gaza lying next to Netanyahu, the war criminal, with his shirt off. I mean, this is not funny. This is the last gasp of a psychotic regime, of a psychotic system that in some way just mutilates. It's a system that we would absolutely have to call, citing Mbembe, it's a necropolitical system. It's a system of death.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that it's incumbent upon those of us who call ourselves progressives to come up with solutions. Because while it's true that maybe at no other time in my lifetime have there been so many people in the streets, I think it's also true that not at any other time have we been at a loss coming up with solutions.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree, but I think, and I may be wrong on this. You know, I think you two are a lot smarter than I am on this. You've been involved in this probably longer than I have. But the thing that has to be acknowledged is that capitalism is not democracy.
That's right.
It's not democracy.
Antithesis. It is the
It's the antithesis. It's the antithesis of democracy. That we need a vision that can imagine a socialism that is as democratic and as just as the future we want. And that has to be, that's why even the left liberal like Mandemi, right? I mean, Mamdani, I mean, that's important because he's at least raising a language that says capitalism doesn't work. Even Bernie Sanders, who shouldn't be part of the Democratic Party, because that's a dead party, you know, should be moving, we should be consolidating all these groups all over the country, all these versions of isolated politics into one mass movement. As my late friend Stanley Aronowitz used to say, the term we need that people can in some way relate to is radical democracy. A democracy that's radical because it gives power to the people. Power to the people, as Richard Wolff would say, as you know, your friend Richard Wolff, right? It has to be about distributing power. It has to be about human rights being linked to questions of power that are distributive, and at the same time refuses those values according to capitalism, in which human need is absolutely irrelevant when it comes to the accumulation of capital, and that any economic actions can be divorced from social responsibility. That's the death of justice.
Absolutely.
That's all that is. It's a death of justice. Let's name it.
We have to tend the soil. Progressives have to tend the soil. Just like the Powell memo was received so readily, we need to prepare our people. You know, we live in a country where civic engagement is like I would say it was a thing of the past. I don't even know if it was ever a thing of the past.
Yeah.
So we've got to get people to understand their role in a democracy.
I mean,
the role of the people is the most important role.
Yeah, we don't want to underestimate that we had in the past movements for social justice that did not equate democracy and capitalism. We had the Black Freedom Movement, we had the Civil Rights Movement, we had SDS, we had the Women's Movement, we had Gay Rights Movement. I mean, they were dangerous because they offered solutions that in some fundamental way seemed to suggest, as C. Wright Mills would say, that if you want justice, renounce capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, if you want justice, ask yourself, what is the vision this system offers for people to live in ways in which dignity matters because justice matters? You know, when you have a country governed by a white supremacist such as Stephen Miller, I mean, a hard-line white supremacist who echoes the lines of Hitler in 1930 and then in his 1930 speeches. The issue here is wake up. Right. You know, it's wake up. I mean, it's time to, not just look at the sky and realize that we're at a point where we could lose democracy forever.
Right.
We're at a point where in the next, I would say, 2 years, the notion of whether this country sort of devolves into just an outright dictatorship. I mean, you have a Republican Party talking about how Trump could possibly, yes, be a dictator, and that would be okay. I mean, this is normalized in one of the most important political parties in the country.
Mhm.
How do you miss this? I mean, what did they say about Hitler in the 30s? We can control him. He's not so bad. Let's ignore the Marxists and the communists and the social democrats. Let's just go where power is because in the end, it'll turn out okay. This is just a joke. It's not a joke anymore.
Oh,
And I
it's
and I
not a
think
joke.
that more and more people are realizing it, and I think more and more people are going to have to do something very, very specific. They're going to have to engage in direct action. I mean, this business of voting, let's wait till the 2026 election. This is crazy.
Mhm.
I mean, this is unreal. I mean, let's stop this government from functioning. That's the issue. Close the ports. Put thousands of people in Washington, D.C. that forces them to react. Give them a sense that collective power works and is not something you can dismiss with a meme that's insulting and suggest that people are stupid and are incapable of recognizing the kind of militarized madness that this regime embodies, or to listen to these silly kind of news reports that come out about, they just parrot stuff that is so ignorant and so stupid. You just shake your head and say, well, where's the media? I mean, where are the journalists? I mean, where are the reporters that matter? Well, they're all being fired, first of all. But secondly, it seems to me the alternative media is maybe all we have left.
It is. I agree. I agree. Well, Henry, once again, you've left us with your pearls of wisdom. Thank you for continuing to write for the LA Progressive and for educating the public. And, we're just on this journey together.
Yes, okay.
It's a highlight of our week, or my week, our week, to these little chats we have with you. We so much enjoy it. Thank you so much, Henry.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.